Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back. Welcome to episode number 22 of the show. Simon Head and Chamatkar Sandhu back in the chair once again as we put a bow on 2016 and look ahead to the first UFC event of 2017. Show number 2 of the year, Sandhu. We obviously look back at Ronda Rousey being pretty much dismantled by Amanda Nunes at UFC 207, but it's all about the new year now, mate, and looking forward to what's to come.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a very interesting year this year, Simon. I think last year was definitely a banner year for all sorts of reasons. I think the coverage of the sport went to new heights. It broke through to new level of the mainstream. There was just so many massive blockbuster stories, blockbuster events, so many key moments. Revenue-wise, it was the biggest year the UFC ever had. It'll be very difficult to do something like that back to back, but that's the challenge the new owners have now, going into their first full calendar year owning this promotion. So it's going to be a very fascinating year to see how things unfold. So looking forward to it. Now, before we kind of crack on with the show, Simon, I think followers of yourself on social media, whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, probably by now would have been made aware of the news that you have departed from the Sun, and we've spoken about this a little bit offline. Before we kind of get into the show, I thought, and we both thought it'd be good to let our very valuable and loyal listeners of the Brit Pack just give you the platform to, I suppose, first of all, explain what's happened, where you currently stand, and I suppose maybe even reflect on your time with the Sun over the last couple of years, just to kind of, I suppose, give our listeners a little bit of insight into what essentially is a very volatile world that we live in. It's one thing being, a member of the media, in the sports world, but when you're dealing with a very, very, a niche sport like MMA, it can be very, very volatile. So with that being said, I'll throw it to you, Simon. Let our listeners know what happened with you and the Sun.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been incredibly disappointing. I've got to be honest with you. It's an occupational hazard when you work in the media. It's pretty cutthroat, and I've experienced it in other jobs as well, where you turn up to work one day and find out that the company's has been shut down, or I was working for a new business startup at the time, or you see people sort of unceremoniously binned off when they've done a good job, and cutbacks kick in, and all these things happen. It's all part of the job, if you like. If we wanted job security, we'd go off and work at the local council, and we'd get a little pay rise every year, and we'd be working 9 to 5, and it'd all be nice and static, but it'd be arse-achingly boring. And I did that for about a year, very, very early on in my career, and knew pretty much straight away that I had to get out of doing that and really, really focus on what I really wanted to do, which was get into the media. And 18 years on, it's been pretty good to me. I've got to be honest. I've been through various different gigs. This one, I've got to say, I was at the Sun for 20 months, and actually we're talking on Tuesday. For those listening, we're talking on the Tuesday. We're recording a day late this week. I'm actually technically still employed at this point. If you're listening beyond Friday, then I won't be. So Friday the 13th is actually the day that I'm being made redundant, and you've got to love the irony of that. I don't know whether someone in the HR department was having some sort of sick joke at my expense. I'm sure they weren't. They've been very lovely to deal with in all seriousness. It's just one of those things. Basically, what I was told was they were unable to find a sponsor for my newspaper column. I had a column in the Sun every Monday. The Sun, for those of you outside the UK, it's one of the country's most read newspapers, the most read tabloid newspaper. I had the opportunity to become, as far as I'm aware, the only full-time MMA only reporter in the UK national press. So I had to throw all my chips in and go all in on this. There's no safety net, no side gig or anything like that. It was all in. And I've been doing it for 20 months, and it's been the best 20 months of my career. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Sean Custis, the head of sport, and Martin Lipton, the deputy head of sport, they sat me down from day one and said, "This is all yours, mate. You just run with it. You tell us what we should be covering and what we shouldn't be covering." And they've never said no. It's been fantastic. Best example of that I can give you is when Michael Bisping fought and won the middleweight title from Luke Rockhold. I wasn't due to go to that event in LA. It was going to be Wyburn versus Rockhold, which would have been a great event. I was looking forward to it. I quite fancied seeing if I could go, but with UFC 200 and that big triple header during fight week around the corner, I didn't want to put that at risk. But then when Wyburn got injured, it was pretty obvious Bisping was going to get a call up. I made the phone call to the office. They didn't hesitate. They said, go. So I went, and I think I was the only British member of the mainstream press there to watch Britain's first world champion crown. Incredibly proud moment for me. And being able to chat with Bisping backstage immediately after the press conference was a bit of a magic moment as well. But yeah, it's one of those things. They couldn't find a sponsor for my newspaper column, which is incredibly frustrating. And I think they're probably making cutbacks anyway. And I was in the danger zone, and they've made the decision. Obviously, I don't agree with it, but this is life. We move on. And so what I'm going to do now is see what other opportunities are out there for me. When I put the message out there on social media, the amount of messages, phone calls, texts, social media messages, and all the rest of it that I got was incredible. Absolutely blew me away. And now, what I need to do now is piece together a few jobs here and there to try and make up the shortfall from losing this gig, because this was my only gig. So we're seeing what's out there at the moment. I've had a few people reach out to me as well, which has been most welcome. And yeah, we'll see where we go from here, mate. It's a little bit of a turbulent time. I knew this was coming from before Christmas. It made Christmas a little less jovial than it normally is, and then it was all confirmed literally just before Christmas that this was going to happen, and now it's just about to happen. So Friday the 13th of all days. I'm not unemployed. I'm a free agent. This is what I'm doing. Or as Misha Tate would say, I'm transitioning. That's what I'm doing at this point. I'm transitioning. So we'll see how it all goes. And fingers crossed. I'll be press row at an event very soon. That's the plan, at least.
Well, I've known about this because we talk all the time. So I knew that this was coming around the corner, and just from my own perspective, I think it's a shame, because at the time when the Sun hired you, I thought it was great, because we've spoken about this many times offline, Simon. If there's opportunities for British journalists to work full time covering the sport for any outlet, all that means is that could potentially open the doors for others to be able to do the same for other competitive outlets. So from my perspective, I thought, well, here's an opportunity where the Sun's getting really committed behind the UFC, and eventually it was not just the UFC, it was MMA, it was the sport. They've got a top guy in yourself who's got tons of experience at the forefront, leading the way. So I thought, great, well, hopefully now some of the competitive papers, instead of using a bunch of freelancers, or just calling boxing guys to come over and jump on a few big Rousey fights or McGregor fights, hey, maybe they'll kind of get behind this sport and get journalists to cover the sport full time. So it's really unfortunate, and I guess it shows where the Sun's commitment lies in MMA, in covering the sport, if they're going to take a full-time guy off the beat. So I've already seen some of the other guys. I don't know them personally. I'm sure they're great people. But when you're constantly churning out Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor clickbaity type of stories, that's not going to do great for you in the long term, especially within our hardcore MMA community, which is the MMA community, especially in the UK. I mean, these are the people that are spending most Saturday nights staying up until 4, 5, 6 in the morning. So it doesn't get any more hardcore than that. So, but I don't want to kind of leave it on a sour or down note. What I want to do is just ask a couple of questions, Si. And I guess the first one is, during your tenure there, you had the opportunity, like you said, you were the only guy that was really full-time covering the sport. You weren't covering boxing or the Olympics or darts or tennis or cricket or rugby or any other sport. It was MMA every day, 24/7. So I guess what I'd like, and I suppose maybe our listeners would like to know, is what were some of your highlights, and what was, I suppose, the key moment during your time there? I think I know what you're going to say anyway, but you tell me, you tell our listeners, what was the biggest highlight of your time covering the sport for the Sun?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think there's been so many amazing experiences. Prior to getting this job, I was like the world's least travelled man. I barely left my house, let alone leave the country. Like, my passport had barely been opened, and so the opportunity to just go to the States for any reason was great. I've always wanted to go, and that first trip to Vegas, which was UFC 189 International Fight Week, was nuts. That was great fun. All the trips have been an incredible experience. I think seeing Bisping win the world title in Englewood was pretty special as a Brit. I think that takes some beating. Being at Madison Square Garden, just to say we were in Madison Square Garden watching the first ever UFC event at Madison Square Garden, that was special. There's so many. Losing my bag in Glasgow, that was a magic moment.
I've just been happy that I've been with you for so many of these great moments.
It's great, and I suspect that whatever I end up doing next, I suspect the transatlantic travel will probably diminish significantly. But I've got a young family at home. I've got a 5-year-old daughter and my wife Anna, and we're expecting another one in June. So that's not necessarily a terrible thing, that I'm going to be a bit closer to home a bit more often. So that's probably a good thing, and probably for the best. But yeah, I don't know what the overall highlight is. I mean, I've had so many. To be honest, the thing I enjoy, other than being able to just be there and cover the sport and try and do a decent enough job of it, it's actually the camaraderie among all the guys. When you go away, and sometimes the main enjoyment you get from your job, sometimes you get it from the job, and sometimes you get it from the people. And I've been really fortunate, because I've been doing basically my dream job for the last 20 months. But I've also been blessed to be able to meet a load of incredible people who've become good friends of mine over the years. And I think that, to me, is probably the biggest takeaway from the whole thing, to be honest, because stuff like that I think matters, and building relationships with people I think counts. So I would say that would be a big highlight, purely from a sporting point of view. I'd have to say Bisping. I think just to look around press row and look at everybody's face when Michael Bisping knocked out Luke Rockhold was quite something. That whole night was absolutely nuts. But for that to happen was, I'd say that was probably top of the tree. The first event I ever covered was UFC 120, and that was Michael Bisping against Yoshihiro Akiyama. So he was one of my first in-person interviews with a UFC fighter, and we know each other pretty well now. And Mike was even kind enough to leave a little message on my Facebook page about the recent news. So that was a nice touch from him as well. But yeah, seeing a Brit win a world title was something pretty special. I'd probably put that number one.
It's interesting, 120 being your first gig to cover the sport. I was just a fan. I was in the crowd, Simon, and here we are. This wonderful sport has brought us together with the Brit Pack. And on that note, any listeners worried? I think there was one or two people that may have kind of dropped a tweet here and there asking if this would be the end, the demise, the book being closed. on the illustrious Brit Pack Podcast? Absolutely not. Me and Simon, we do this. We don't get paid for it. We do it for the love of the sport. We do it just to kind of get our opinions out there in a different format other than writing words, down on a piece of paper or something, and it's completely independent. This is something that we can do very, very easily. It's just me and Simon talking shop for an hour or two. So this isn't going anywhere. We're still going to be churning out this show for you guys on a weekly basis, regardless of our employment status, until I suppose we can't afford to pay the Wi-Fi bill. I guess I'll throw it back to you, Simon, to end this segment with whatever it is you want to kind of get off your chest or say, and then we can crack on with the show.
Yeah, I just want to very quick, because this all feels a little bit weird even talking about it, but I just want to say I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity I had. I've got no ill will towards the people that I was working with, and quite the opposite. In fact, the guys on the paper have been outstanding to deal with, and I wish them all the best. And I've got nothing but good things to say about the people I was working with. I know a lot of people were tweeting less than complimentary things with regard to a few things, but and I understand where some of that's coming from. But from a personal point of view, no problem whatsoever. In terms of all the editorial guys I dealt with, so just wanted to say that, and a big thank you to everybody who did reach out with a message. And I'm as Michael Bisping would say, I'm not going anywhere. I just don't know what I'm going to do yet. We'll work it out. But one thing I will be doing is the Brit Pack, and what better way than to just kick on with this one, number 22. Now we had a bit of a review show last week because we had Ronda Rousey losing in dramatic fashion to Amanda Nunes. We haven't had anything since, so it seems to be the time of year when everyone starts pontificating and offering up their end of year awards, and so I don't see why we really should be any different. We should at least acknowledge some of the best stuff from the year. We're not going to go into it in too much detail, I don't think, just because you've probably heard it done to death elsewhere, but we've got our own take on a few of these awards, and we thought we'd share a bit of that with you. And then a bit later on in the show, we'll look ahead to the first UFC event of 2017, Yair Rodriguez versus BJ Penn. So we'll do that. Sandhu, you've knocked up a few categories, mate. So you might as well lead off.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not going to do 20 categories. We're going to keep this short and sweet. We've got 5 or 6 categories that we wanted to kind of address. And we're going to kick things off, Simon, with the male fighter of the year. For me, we've dropped his name a few times. You certainly have in your experience of capturing the middleweight championship. For me, it was Michael Bisping. It was finally, he wasn't the bridesmaid, but not the bride anymore. He finally got to walk down the aisle, so to speak. He got his moment in London against Anderson Silva. A fantastic comeback fight, which in its own right is a potential fight of the year candidate. He then went on in dramatic fashion on very short notice to capture the middleweight championship from Luke Rockhold, one of the best in the world, especially given his age bracket and where he comes from. And then finally, to top things off, he brought a UFC pay-per-view back to the UK after a very long time, and he got to do that in his backyard in Manchester, get rid of the demons of the H-bomb landed by Dan Henderson back at UFC 100 with UFC 203, which we were both present for in a sold-out Manchester arena. So for me, at 37 years of age, just given how close he was for so many years, never quite managed to get over the hill. He finally did it this year, and he did it the hard way. Nothing was given on a plate at all. It was definitely his banner year, and I'm sure after you kind of give your verdict for male fighter of the year, we'll throw in an honourable mention or two, because it was one of those years. It was very, very difficult to pick a fighter of the year, especially for me being a Brit. I don't want to be biased and just give it to Michael Bisping because he is a fellow Brit, but I did it based purely on meritocracy and the journey that he's been on. And I think it's just it has been a fantastic story just to never give up in life. I think it was just a fantastic story to see a guy at 37 who many thought was never even good enough to win a championship, let alone do it at this stage of his career. I think spoke very, very highly of what work and effort he put in. And now look at him, he's the darling of the UFC. He's doing movies. I think tonight was actually the Triple X movie premiere here at the O2 Arena in London. And I know, looking at social media, Michael was doing his bits and pieces on the red carpet. So good for him. He's now taking the advantage of being a champion, maximizing and capitalizing on those opportunities outside of the octagon. So there you go, male fighter of the year for me, Michael Bisping.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to sort of quantify exactly what criteria you're going to use to award a male fighter of the year. Is it to the person who's won the most fights? Is it to the person who's won his fights most decisively or in a most dominant fashion? Is it someone who's taken the longest journey or the biggest step in terms of progression over the course of the year? And there's loads of different ways you can do it. I've gone for Michael Bisping as well. And the reason I've gone for Michael Bisping as well, there are other fighters who have won more fights in 2016 than Michael Bisping. There are other fighters who have also won world championships and won more fights in a year than Michael Bisping. The thing for me is the fact that no one gave the guy a prayer. No one gave him much of a prayer against Anderson Silva. Most people were thinking Anderson Silva would beat him. He beat Anderson Silva, and he beat in the hard way. That was a fight that he'd wanted for a long, long, long time. When Anderson Silva was a world champion, Bisping had 3 separate number 1 contender fights, lost each and every one of them, and I think at least 2 of those fights had asterisks against them as a result of either performance enhancers or TRT use. So there were issues there that maybe his chance had been and gone, and he kept coming back and he kept coming back, and he just kept getting knocked down again. And then he had the horrific eye injury that knocked him out of his dream event in Manchester, and that set him back even further. And then he came back and got beat by Tim Kennedy. At that point, everyone said he's done, he's finished, and it's one of those where the journey that he's taken and the fact that he defied all the odds. He beat Anderson Silva, and everyone thought, great, he can retire on that. He got the fight that he's been chasing all his life, and he won, and he did it at home. Now he can hang up his gloves and be happy. Then he got that last gasp call up to face Luke Rockhold, and I think you do well to find a single person in Los Angeles that week who genuinely thought Michael Bisping was going to win that fight. Everyone was pretty much nailed on that Luke Rockhold was going to win, and I wrote a piece on the eve of the fight. I'll be honest, I thought Luke Rockhold was going to win, but I had this funny feeling, and I wrote about it, and I said, there's just this weird feeling in the air that something special might happen here. Just everything about fight week, the way he'd gone about things, he didn't seem to have the pressure on him that he usually put on himself. He was relaxed, he was joking with people. It felt like a different Michael Bisping, and he went in there, relaxed as you like, straight off a movie set and knocked out Luke Rockhold. Amazing. Then he gets the Dan Henderson fight, and I know a lot of people out there will and did question the choice of Dan Henderson. That wasn't his pick, that was the UFC's pick. They obviously wanted to do that fight because it was a sellable fight for Bisping in the UK. It would generate more interest than fighting someone like Jacare, for example. And to get decked by that big H-bomb twice in Manchester and then come back and win that was astonishing. So he's my fighter of the year. He's my fighter of the year. I think he deserved to be nominated for the BBC Sports Personality of the Year for our British listeners. You'll know what that is. For the overseas listeners, it's a bit like the ESPYs, but less glamorous. It's in the UK, we have the BBC, which is the state broadcaster here in the UK, the big state broadcaster, and they do a big end-of-year celebration gala thing where they honour the best of British sport. It's done by a panel, and I don't think a single person on that panel could name a mixed martial arts fighter. So Bisping had pretty much no chance at that point, and it's a shame because his achievements this year stacked up with pretty much everybody on that BBC Sports Personality of the Year list, and I think he deserved a little more credit than he got. So he's my fighter of the year. But it was by no means a clear thing because there were some outstanding other candidates as well, and one in particular.
Well, I'll let you lead off with your honourable mention, Simon, as that was a nice little segue before I go into mine. Who was your honourable mention for 2016?
Cody Garbrandt. Cody Garbrandt has had one hell of a year. Unranked, 4 fights, 4 wins, world title. It doesn't get much better for Cody, and I think a star has been born in the UFC. I think we're going to hear and see a lot from Cody Garbrandt in 2017 and beyond. I think the star makers who are WME IMG are going to do well. I think they've got a ready package star there. They just need to guide him in the right direction, put him in front of the right opportunities, and I think he could really become a poster boy for the sport in the next 12 to 18 months. He had a fantastic year. And to go in there and beat Dominic Cruz, not just to beat Dominic Cruz, but to beat him in the way he did it, really just leaps out as just an outstanding achievement. Even if you just take that fight in its isolation, that was an outstanding achievement. And the journey he's taken, as I say, from unranked to world champion in the space of 4 fights in 1 calendar year. And I know other outlets and other podcasts and all the rest of it, some people were naming Cody Garbrandt as fighter of the year. Got no argument with that. I think that he's as worthy, to be honest. But he's worthy for different reasons. And I've just gone with Michael Bisping for the reasons I explained earlier. But it all depends on your criteria. Cody Garbrandt is one of the fighters of the year. And he's following his story in 2017. I think he's going to make for absolutely fascinating viewing. It's going to be really interesting in one of the most exciting divisions in the UFC right now. That bantamweight division looks absolutely fantastic, packed with talent, and he's leading the way. It's so yeah. He's my honourable mention, Cody Garbrandt.
Yeah, and I think going into the criteria is a very good point, Simon, because if those of you out there listening have Conor McGregor as your fighter of the year, I've got no problem with that. If you've got Stipe Miocic as your fighter of the year, I've got no problem with that. If you've got Cody Garbrandt as your fighter of the year, I've got no problem with that. And Cody is actually also my honourable mention. For all the reasons that you mentioned there, Simon. Fascinating story, like you said, to go from unranked to champion, 4 wins, 3 knockouts in the first round, and then to put on what was essentially a masterclass on Dominic Cruz, and to do that with the arrogance and the panache and some of the charisma, push-ups and breakdancing and all sorts in the actual fight itself was just mind-blowing. So looking forward to seeing him continue that. And I think now he's proven that, I genuinely didn't see that coming, and I think we spoke about that in last week's show. I literally thought of him as a power puncher, a first-round type of fighter. But now knowing that he's got that in his locker, I think he's unbeatable. I think he could potentially... He's got everything going for him. And as long as he can handle everything that comes along with being a champion and the fame and the fortune and all those bits and pieces, he's got all the tools to potentially dominate this division for years to come. And he's only 25, so he should only improve from here on end. So with that being said, let's move on to the female fighter of the year. And I'll let you go first this time, Simon, on this one. Who is your female fighter of the year 2016?
Female fighter of the year is Amanda Nunes. I had 2 names down, but Amanda Nunes gets it. If you look at the 3 wins that she's had in 2016. First off, she beat Valentina Shevchenko, who is now 1 fight away from a shot at the title. So we may well see that fight run back very soon. She beat her by unanimous decision back at UFC 196 in Vegas. She then got a shot at Miesha Tate and the World Championship. And let's not forget, that was the main event of UFC 200. We had all the furore that happened when John Jones failed his USADA drug test, was pulled from the main event. It was then going to be Brock Lesnar versus Mark Hunt. That lasted for 1 day, and then they realised we should really put a World Championship fight at the top of that card. So they then made the switch again. Third main event in the space of 2.5 days. They then made Miesha Tate versus Amanda Nunes the main event. And she put on an absolutely superb performance. Defeated Miesha Tate, busted her up badly, then took her to the mat, locked up the rear naked choke, and got the win. And then she followed it up with an even more decisive win against Ronda Rousey just a matter of weeks ago, December 30th. The last UFC fight of 2016. And that for me capped her as the female fighter of the year. Great performance. And we're starting to see a bit of the personality come out from her as well, which I think is great. And there's an awful lot of upside with Amanda Nunes. I'm going to stop short of saying that she's an absolute superstar at this point, because I don't think she is. But I think if she can continue to turn in performances like that, then I can see her becoming certainly one of the most talked about female fighters in recent memory. I think I'd love to see her fight Holly Holm. I think that would be a fascinating contest, and if Holly wins that featherweight belt, we could have a champion versus champion matchup later in the year. Maybe even during International Fight Week. Who knows? That would be quite something. But Amanda Nunes for me gets the vote for female fighter of the year.
Yeah, me too. We're 2 for 2 so far, Simon. Amanda Nunes, for all the reasons you mentioned, and it's been great exposure for her to fight in the main event of UFC 200. That did 1 million plus pay-per-view buys. That was a blockbuster event, and then to fight and defend her championship for the first time, against the biggest star one of the biggest stars in the sport for sure, especially on the women's side of things, in Ronda Rousey. Again, reports coming out that also did 1 million plus buys. That wouldn't have hurt her at all. She's had a lot of eyeballs on her this year. She's put in the performances. She won the championship, and she's been dominant in everything that she's done. And like you said, Simon, we've started to see her personality come through now. Everything that she did, I think, throughout Fight Week at UFC 207 was just A+ from her. And I'm looking forward to seeing how things progress with her in 2017. And with that being said, my honourable mention goes to a European, and that's to Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I thought she had still one of my personal favourite fights of 2016. Her defence against Claudia Gadelha was just phenomenal. Coming, from arguably the first and maybe even second round, where it was very, very tough early on, to come back and to keep the faith in the long-term game plan of a 25-minute fight, and then to really put it on Claudia in rounds 3, 4, and 5. I loved everything about that fight. It was just phenomenal. And then obviously she wanted to fight on that UFC 205 card in Madison Square Garden. She got her wish, and it was against a fellow Pole in Karolina Kowalkiewicz. So for me, honourable mention is Joanna Jędrzejczyk. Who is your honourable mention, my friend?
Well, at the risk of being boring, I'm going to say that as well. But seeing as you've so eloquently described why Joanna had such a fantastic year, I will chuck a different name into the mix just to change things up a bit. I want to give a shout out to Raquel Pennington. She had a superb 2016. She picked up a split decision win over Betch Correia at UFC on Fox in Tampa in April. She followed up with a win over Elizabeth Phillips at UFC 202. And then she picked up the biggest win of her career, defeating Miesha Tate at Madison Square Garden, no less, at UFC 205. She's always brought exciting action to the octagon, has an exciting fighting style, and is starting to move into contention status now. She's gradually moving up, and I think 2016 was a really big year. If you were listing maybe an unsung hero of the women's division, I would probably chuck her name in there. Joanna, I think, for her two barn burner fights against Claudia Gadelha and Karolina Kowalkiewicz, deserves to be the honourable mention. And but yeah, seeing as you had already gone over that ground, I'll chuck Raquel Pennington's name into the mix as well. I think she's had a fantastic year.
Good shout. And with that being said, let's move on now to the 2016 Brit Pack Fight of the Year. Now, I actually was in two very interesting places for what I think are arguably 1A and 1B when it comes to Fight of the Year. It was a toss-up, and I really had to think hard about this one. It was either going to be Robbie Lawler versus Carlos Condit at UFC 195, for which I was actually in Michigan, in Detroit, Michigan, on a family holiday, and it was kind of weird because I actually had to pay $60 to actually purchase the pay-per-view, which I don't normally have to do, obviously being here in the UK, watching it on BT Sport. And then for the second, nomination in my head in terms of who I would give the nod to, I was in the Grosvenor Casino, our wonderful friends in the Grosvenor Casino, with my pal Simon for UFC 206, watching the war that was Cub Swanson versus Doo Ho Choi. I eventually ended up going with Cub Swanson versus Doo Ho Choi, and I've got no problem if anybody out there chooses Robbie Lawler and Carlos Condit. I don't know what I think with Robbie Lawler, Carlos Condit, because they are so elite, they are championship level fighters. A tight contest like that, you almost expect it. You don't really expect one fighter to dominate the other one in such a one-sided affair. Whereas I think with Cub Swanson and Doo Ho Choi, you had two very different stories coming into the fight. With the Korean Superboy, you had this fantastic prospect that everyone's really glowing about and just raving about his potential. The ceiling on him is so high. And then perhaps I think with Cub Swanson, I think a lot of people were perhaps writing him off. I think a lot of people thought, he's just being fed to the lions here with this younger phenom in Doo Ho Choi. And then as things played out, it was, if anybody, if you were a fly on the wall in the Grosvenor Casino, all you would have heard from, I think both from myself and Simon, but maybe a little bit more from me,
no, definitely from you.
Oohs and ahs and F-bombs and OMGs and WTFs at the big screen in there. For a 15-minute fight, it felt like it was longer. We just couldn't believe what we were witnessing. And again, it may be that participation in watching that fight unfold with you, Simon, just having you there with me, being able to kind of talk about it as things were going on. We kept looking at each other like, are we actually witnessing what we're witnessing? And maybe it's just a little bit more fresh in my memory, the fact that it only took place literally about a month ago now. But for me, 2016 Fight of the Year is Cub Swanson, Doo Ho Choi at UFC 206. Over to you, Simon.
Good shout, and I'm delighted you picked that one because it means that we're at least going to disagree on one of these awards, because I've gone with Robbie Lawler versus Carlos Condit at UFC 195. Great title fights are... There's something special about a big title fight, and sometimes when you're watching these guys go at it in the octagon, it becomes almost bigger than sport. It's just like a study of the human condition, just watching. It's like the immovable object versus the irresistible force, and that's what we had with Robbie Lawler and Carlos Condit. They threw everything they had at each other, and the image that will always stay with me is the image right at the end of the fight where both fighters, completely spent, were leant side by side up against the octagon fence with their arms sort of draped over the top of the octagon fence there. And I think the referee, Big John McCarthy, came over and sort of patted them both on the back as if to say, "Good job, lads. That was a bit special." And that fight was incredible. And I remember at the time, almost to a man, everybody who was watching that event in the media were like, "Well, that's Fight of the Year wrapped up. And nothing's going to beat that." And we had some absolute crackers this year. We really were sport rotten with some of the great fights we've had this year. But for me, just for the scale of the fight, the fact that I've not seen two men push each other that hard for that long. Over a 5-round fight, the intensity level just never dropped. Robbie Lawler was in the fight of 2015 as well. Don't forget, he and Rory MacDonald at UFC 189 in that was very, very similar in that regard. But in the end, Lawler began to break McDonald down and eventually stopped him. This one was just, it was so close to call. Lawler won it. I scored it for Condit, and I know a lot of other people agreed, and they scored it for Condit as well. But it was such a close fight, and it seems almost negligent that fight wasn't remade. It was one of the great, not just one of the best fights of the year. It's one of the greatest fights I think I've ever seen in the octagon. It was that good, and that's my fight of the year. UFC 195, Robbie Lawler, Carlos Condit.
And I guess with honourable mentions, we can do swapsy, Simon, because my honourable mention would naturally be Robbie Lawler versus Carlos Condit at UFC 195. I don't want to hazard a guess at what yours is going to be, but Simon, go for it. The floor is yours. What is your honourable mention for fight of the year?
I've got 3. I'm cheating. I've got 3, and the Doo Ho Choi Cub Swanson fight isn't one of them. That fight was
okay.
Yeah, that fight was amazing. I'm not going to lie, that fight was amazing, but I've seen 3 better. I would say Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor 2 at UFC 202 was everything a main event fight should be. If you were going to sit someone down and say, watch mixed martial arts at the highest level being contested by 2 guys who are absolutely at the top of their game in an environment that just shows the sport at its best. Diaz McGregor at the T-Mobile Arena, the rematch, that was absolutely brilliant. I think Dana White said it was like the Hagler Hearns of mixed martial arts. I don't know if it was quite up to that standard, but it wasn't far off. It was an incredible match. That's the one I eventually gave my honourable mention to, but I need to mention 2 more. Mike Perry versus Danny Roberts is a fight that probably won't get mentioned that much. That fight was incredible in Manchester. It's not perhaps the most fashionable fight to sort of pick out. 2 guys who are sort of still in sort of the prospect stage of their careers. Those 2 laid it on the line, and it was a real clash of striking styles. You had the slicker style of Danny Roberts versus the more powerful, heavy-handed approach of Mike Perry, and it was an incredible fight. I remember we were watching that one from Octagon side, and we could almost feel those shots going in as they were landing on each other. It was an amazing fight. Both guys came out of that with immense credit. And the other one I wanted to mention, undercard fighters don't always get the same shine. They're not the biggest names. They don't get the biggest pay packets, and they don't get the biggest viewing audience. And the first fight of the night at UFC 199 was one of the most bonkers matchups I've ever seen in my life. Polo Reyes versus Dong Hyun Kim was the first fight of the night at UFC 199 at the Forum, and that fight had everything except for head movement. Sandhu, it had it was just ridiculous. And when you go to a UFC event and you're there covering it from Octagon side, what you find is, because different people have different responsibilities when they get there, so the media who turn up at cage side, they tend to arrive in dribs and drabs as the prelims are starting. And there are some sort of hardy souls who are always there from the very beginning, our good friend John Morgan being one of them. But there are others who sort of come in a bit later on. Some only turn up for the main card and all the rest of it. Anybody who turned up after that fight missed out on an absolute barn burner. Polo Reyes versus Dong Hyun Kim. Polo Reyes won it by 3rd round knockout. If you've got UFC Fight Pass, go back, watch the fight. Just be good to yourself. Go back, watch the fight. Watch Lawler Condit, then watch Polo Reyes versus Dong Hyun Kim. Completely opposite ends of the spectrum. Both absolutely batshit crazy mixed martial arts fights. And it just shows that big names don't necessarily matter when it comes to fights. It's about good matchmaking. And the UFC made a cracker of a match there. Polo Reyes, Dong Hyun Kim. That's my wild card.
Really appreciate you bringing up Danny Roberts versus Mike Perry, Simon, because you and me were both cage side for that one. And the heart and grit and determination that Danny Roberts showed just to survive, especially in those closing moments before the ref waved it off, was just incredible to see a human being just try and survive in that kind of onslaught. So fantastic shout there. Right. So now we're going to move on to the event of the year. And I think it's your turn. So over to you, Simon. You can go first. What is your event of 2016?
This was such a tough one. And even when I was putting together my notes for the show, because believe it or not, I do put notes together occasionally for the show. I know it doesn't sound like it most of the time. But I've gone back and forth on this, back and forth. I think I'm going to have to go with UFC 199. I think UFC 199 all in just had a bit of everything. Let me explain why. Marco Polo Reyes versus Dong Hyun Kim. I've just waxed lyrical about that fight. That was the first fight of the night. We had a bizarre draw. Kevin Casey and Elvis Matapchik. And then everything just seemed to escalate once we hit the TV portion of the card. Alex Caceres and Cole Miller went to a decision. Then all hell broke loose. Jessica Andrade destroys Jessica Penne. Beneil Dariush knocks out James Vick in ridiculous fashion. Brian Ortega knocks out Clay Guida with a flying knee. Then we're into the main card. We're all hyped up to the eyeballs as we go into the main card. Dustin Poirier takes on Bobby Green. Bobby Green stands in front of Poirier and goads him, so Poirier knocks him out clean. Dan Henderson does to Hector Lombard what really you should get thrown in prison for. I don't really. It was one of the single most brutal knockouts I've ever seen. Boxing, kickboxing, mixed martial arts. That knockout of Hector Lombard by Dan Henderson was just off the charts ridiculous. Then we had Max Holloway, Ricardo Lamas. Amazing back and forth fight with one of the most iconic moments of the entire year, where in the last 10 seconds, Holloway looks at Lamas, fixes him with a stare, points to the ground and says, "Let's bang." And then they just plant their feet and go for it. That in itself would make this event of the year. But then we had Dominic Cruz's masterclass against Uriah Faber to retain his UFC Bantamweight Championship. And then the cherry on top of the icing, on top of a very, very large, spectacular, delicious cake at the Forum in LA, Britain's own Michael the Count Bisping strolls in off a movie set. 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, 2 minutes. He didn't care. Straight in there, wallop. 3 minutes, 36 seconds. Knocks out Luke Rockhold. Britain has a UFC World Champion. UFC 199 is my event of the year.
Good shout. And I guess I'll probably get into this when we kind of talk about our honourable mentions. But this was a very, very tough category. I think a lot of these categories are quite tough to mull over when looking back at 2016, and I kind of guess it goes back to what we were saying at the start of the show. It was just a fantastic year all round. I have ended up going with UFC 196. Now, top to bottom, it didn't produce, a classic 5-star fight after fight after fight. But sometimes I don't think an event needs to. That event got turned on its head very dramatically in this short space of just a few weeks. It was supposed to be Conor McGregor versus Rafael dos Anjos for the lightweight championship. RDA had to pull out due to injury. In steps Nate Diaz, straight off a yacht or a boat, knocking back some tequila with his buddy, his scrap pack member Gilbert Melendez. And I remember being in Orlando, Florida. No, actually, I was in Orlando, Florida, and I was connecting to a flight to Miami before coming home to London. And I remember being at the terminal, and the UFC had just very, very quickly put together a makeshift press conference in one of their gyms somewhere in I think it was the LA area, or somewhere in California anyway. And it was so bare bones. But that press conference between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz just got everyone so excited. And to the point where I was watching it, I was streaming it using the airport Wi-Fi, really willing to skip my flight and just maybe try and blag it and get on the next flight back home, because I didn't want to miss this press conference. I was watching it live on my phone. It was gripping, to say the least. Diaz and McGregor just throwing bars at each other. It was just fantastic stuff, and it was all raw and it was all natural. The fact that this fight came together so quickly, just on 11 days' notice, and the fact that it ended up becoming the biggest selling pay-per-view in UFC history, And then on top of that, I was actually at the event. Now I was at the event from a quite a unique perspective, and I've done this a few times in the past where I'll work the media week with MMA Junkie, but I didn't want to work the fight night, so I got myself a ticket. And it's interesting because the fight came around on such a quick turnaround. The actual ticket it still has Conor McGregor versus RDA on it, which might be worth some money in the future. Actually, I tell you why my ticket might be worth some money down the future, because I was actually in section 209, which is quite ironic. And then to see, not just before the main event, to see Holly Holm and Miesha Tate go through their 25 minutes before Miesha Tate dramatically got that rear naked choke finish. Just to see her story come full circle, finally get that UFC championship, given the journey she's been on. She's 100% been a pioneer of women's MMA. It was a fantastic moment for her, and also surprising and shocking, given how just a few months earlier, Holly Holm had shocked the world by knocking out Ronda Rousey. And then to follow that up with, at the time, the invincible Conor McGregor, where Mystic Mac had predicted everything would go his way, and for him to get tapped out by Nate Diaz in the second round, the place went absolutely bananas. And again, maybe it was because I was in the arena that night, and it was just a really weird feeling where you had, the Irish were representing, but you had the California fans, representing the Diaz brothers and Nate Diaz himself, and it was a star-making performance for Nate Diaz. It was definitely his coming out party. He became a bona fide draw and star from that scenario. So you don't always need a 10, 11, 12 fight card where every single fight is finishes in a finish or a submission or a knockout. Every fight is a war. Sometimes it could just be the story behind the event, the emotions on the night, and just the co-main event and the main event delivering and then some. So for me, UFC 196 was my event of the year, and I'll quickly just hit my honourable mentions. UFC 199, right up there, Simon, for all the reasons you mentioned. It was a surreal experience. You were actually at the event. I was at home watching it. Fantastic fights all throughout the card, but then there were obviously so many other things that were going on online with fight announcements and obviously things that happened with some of the guys over at MMAfighting.com. It was a surreal, bizarre, event-filled night of just news back to back, which made that event and made that night so memorable. And apart from that, I have to obviously give a nod to UFC 205. It was fantastic to be there with you and the rest. And for me, what made that event so memorable, aside from obviously McGregor becoming the two-weight champion and it being in Madison Square Garden and being a fan of that arena for so many years through my passion and love for pro wrestling, it was great to be at an event with a lot of the European crew who've been, on the grind and doing their rounds for so many years, and it was great to be there with yourself and Abby and some of the others. So that would always be a memorable a trip, and of course a historic moment in our sport with McGregor doing what he did in MSG. So those are my honourable mentions, Simon. Take it away with your honourable mentions.
Yeah, and I said I really struggled to decide what my event of the year would be, and I eventually settled on UFC 199. The reason why I struggled so much was because the other one that really stood out to me was UFC 202. And there's a slightly different story with UFC 202. First of all, the fight card was insane. There were 12 fights on that card, and 9 of them were finished inside the distance. We had a run of 5 finishes in a row as we went from the prelims all the way up to the co-main event. 4 TKOs in a row, and then a huge knockout from Anthony Rumble Johnson on Glover Teixeira. We saw Donald Cerrone dismantle Rick Story. Mike Perry knocked out Hyun-Gyu Lim. That was his UFC debut. Tim Means does what Tim Means does, just goes in there and gets nasty with his opponent, and he did that with Sabah Humasi. And Cody Garbrandt booked himself a title shot by beating Takeya Mizugaki at the top of the prelim card. But it wasn't just about that fight card on the night, the actual whole event, and this is why I struggled whether or not to pick this one, because I remember we turned up in Las Vegas, and this is a Conor McGregor fight week, and whenever Conor McGregor fight week kicks in, all hell breaks loose. We turned up for the pre-fight press conference, and there was a noticeable absence of any buzz. It was really bizarre, and we were all talking about it. We were all like, this is really weird. Normally, Conor McGregor Fight Week, the place is jumping, and it just feels really strange. It's just everything seemed really muted, and I thought, what? There's something not quite right here, and we couldn't quite put a finger on it. But everything just felt really subdued, and we were talking about it literally as they were getting ready to start the press conference. Then the press conference happens. It was in the David Copperfield Theatre in the MGM Grand, and all hell broke loose. Diaz walked out the press conference, chucked up a few obscenities, then started chucking bottles. A cup of cappuccino was thrown at one point. A journalist had to grab his laptop to stop Jake Shields from throwing that. Then McGregor started throwing cans of Monster Energy. It all went mad. Then the open workouts went even more crazy. McGregor did his big mic drop, and it ramped up. It ramped up. The weigh-ins were just insane. It was in a big building called the Marquee Ballroom. It was like an aircraft hangar, and the only security in the room were little old ladies. And honestly, I've been to some football matches in the past where there's been some crowd trouble, and you can sense the sort of simmering tension in the air when you go into those sorts of environments. It felt like that. And I was genuinely concerned that there was going to be some tensions boiling over. To the immense credit of everybody there, everyone was impeccably behaved. There was no trouble, certainly that I'm aware of or that I saw. Everything was generally pretty good natured, and the atmosphere was just outstanding. And then the fight night itself, and we had that remarkable performance by Conor McGregor. As he got revenge over Nate Diaz. So that was really, really close to being my event of the year. And as I'm describing it, I'm beginning to wonder whether it should have been. But I'm sticking with UFC 199, and UFC 202 is my honourable mention. But it's like 1A and 1B. It was that close.
Brilliant. And now we head into the final category of the inaugural Brit Pack yearly awards. Maybe next year we'll double the amount of categories, but we're going to keep it short and sweet. Like I said, the final category is the Brit Pack British Fighter of the Year. This one was very, very simple for me. I'm not going to call Michael Bisping the Male Fighter of the Year without also giving him the nod for British Fighter of the Year. Like we mentioned in numerous times now over the show, the very first British champion in the UFC. To do it at his age, absolutely phenomenal. Very, very simple, short and sweet. Michael Bisping, British Fighter of the Year. Over to you, Si.
You can't not give that award to Michael Bisping. You know, we've had a lot of British fighters in the UFC. People who've made their debuts. People who've, there's so many names where you can chuck in. Not going to win Fighter of the Year, but it's people have had their just desserts and been given a chance in the UFC. It was great to see Jimmy Warhead get his shot in the UFC. In Hamburg. It didn't go his way on the night. Hopefully we'll see him again, but that's a guy who really deserved to get his shot, and he finally did. Mark Diakiese, I think, has exploded onto the scene. He's had an amazing year, and I think he's up there with... He's not quite up there with Bisping, but he's just a gnats below. Mark Diakiese had 2 huge knockout wins for Bama in 2016, and then he earned himself his shot in the UFC, fought Lucas Sajewski, and then he obviously followed that up with a very, very hard-earned win over Frankie Perez. You've got to give a mention to Paddy Pimblett at Cage Warriors. He's exploded onto the scene, picked up a world championship belt with them. The sky's the limit for him. There are guys, sort of beyond Bisping who've had big years. From sort of the British fighting stable, but I think the man at the very top, Michael the Count Bisping. Also, I just want to give a quick mention to Jimmy Manoa, who he picked up that big knockout win that I think those who've been following his career for any length of time have known he's had in the locker, and he's just been unfortunate he hasn't been able to produce it in the octagon. But boy, when he put over St. Preux away. The world woke up and took notice. That was pretty special. So yeah, a lot of British guys have done some great stuff, both at the UFC level and at European level. But yeah, Michael Bisping gets British Fighter of the Year, no question about it. He's the first British world champion, and deservedly so.
Yeah, same reasons for honourable mention. Jimmy Manuwa, Mark Diakiese. For Diakiese making your UFC debut, there's so much pressure involved. But he got through that, and he's off and running now. He's doing well. He's 2 for 2 in the UFC, and you can't ask for more than that within the first 12 months of your UFC career. And for Manuwa, I remember a few years back. When he suffered that defeat to Gustafsson, and then obviously he suffered that knockout loss to Anthony Johnson. Some might question, where he could go from there, but he came back in true, with some true British grit, and he had a great night in Manchester, like you mentioned, Simon, and I think he can now tick on from there. Now he's broken into the top 5. And I think he's got some big fights ahead of him. Obviously, the one with Corey Anderson in London, which was announced and confirmed this week, will be the first one. And I think having that hometown advantage, again, getting a big win over Corey Anderson, then that's it. I think he could just be after that one fight away from title contention. And that's it, Si. That was our very first Brit Pack yearly awards. You agree? You disagree? Let us know about it. Whilst we've been recording the show, I've just been tweeting out our results via the Brit Pack MMA, which is our podcast Twitter handle. So please, if you like them, if you agree, please do give it a like, give it a share, retweet it, and all that good stuff. If you disagree, let us know about it. But that now means we can move on, Simon, to a bit of a breakdown of the very first UFC event of 2017, which will see Yair Rodriguez take on BJ Penn in the main event.
Yeah, it's the first event of 2017. It's kind of easing us in, if we're honest. It's not the most stellar fight card, but as we know, you can't judge how good this event is going to be just by looking at the names on a sheet of paper. It might not have top to bottom star power like some of the big pay per views we were very fortunate to have towards the back end of last year. But when you've got exciting fighters like Yair Rodriguez, Joe Lozon, Ben Saunders, and Sergio Pettis on this card, then you're going to expect something half decent when you tune in on Sunday night. Because that's one thing to mention. This is a Sunday night fight card. Which is a bit of a pain in the backside for all us British fans who have to get up for work on Monday morning. Obviously, I don't have to worry about that at the moment. So, but for all the rest of you lucky bastards who've still got a job, then that's going to be hard for you. I, on the other hand, will have a lie-in. So, but yeah, so it's Sunday night, which makes things a little bit tricky. Yair Rodriguez versus BJ Penn. It's interesting matchmaking, this, and the more I think about this fight and the more I've heard going into this fight, the more interested I am in it. When I first heard about it, I was like, crikey, what are they doing to BJ Penn? Why are they giving him someone like Yair Rodriguez? And the more I go, for a start, BJ's working with Jason Perillo, as he has done for quite a while. And Perillo, I think, for me, he's probably my vote for Coach of the Year. I think he's had an outstanding year. What he's done with Bisping has been nothing short of remarkable. But if he can get BJ Penn firing on all cylinders again, I think that even eclipses what he's done with Bisping, because Penn hasn't won a fight in 6 years. So this is what we're looking at here. He's fighting Yair Rodriguez, who he's got a good record. He's got a good record. He's got that highlight reel knockout of Andre Fili. But if you take a look at it, you look at his UFC career to date, it's been decisions all the way, with that one exception. That Andre Fili flying head kick is obviously what gets played and replayed, but he's had 4 fights in the UFC, 5 fights in the UFC, should I say. 4 of them have been by decision, and 2 of them by split. So this is by no means sort of a wrecking machine who's going in destroying everybody who he steps in the octagon with. So it's going to be really interesting to find out just how good is Yair Rodriguez. And I was listening to him on the MMA Hour with Yair Helwani, and there were a few little warning lights started flashing in front of my eyes when I was listening to some of it. He's changing a lot. He seems to be changing a lot of his training camps. He seems to be bouncing from gym to gym. He's not short of confidence, and he was certainly speaking very well. But it worries me that he hasn't got he doesn't seem to have a settled training camp. And even when he was asked whether this training camp was going to be his long-term home, he didn't commit to that either, which that worries me, sort of looking forward in his career. I think you need to find a stable home. You need to get people around you that you can trust and who can be honest with you and tell you when you're doing things wrong and tell you when you're making bad decisions and encourage you when you're making good ones. And to see that at this relatively young stage in his UFC career, and he's only 24 years of age, and he's sort of bouncing from fight camp to fight camp, that worries me a little bit. He should put BJ Penn away. He should win the fight. He's talking about submitting him, which I think is just remarkable. I think that gives BJ Penn the best chance to win the fight. If I'm honest, BJ Penn, the one thing that he isn't lacking is his jiu-jitsu. So, he might not have the cardio that he had. He might not be quite as slick with his hands, but his jiu-jitsu, I would think, will probably be the thing that sticks with him the most. He's been doing that for the longest, and to start talking about taking him down and subbing him, there's a few little warning signs there, and I'm really looking forward to watching this one. But it should be a win for Alex Caceres, but I don't know if it's as clear cut as a lot of people think it might be. So it's a fascinating one, mate, and I'm really not. It's going to be really interesting to see just how good Yair looks and just where he goes with his career, because there were just a few little warning signs in that interview. If you haven't checked it out, check it out. The MMA Hour with Yair Helwani. Very interesting interview. As I say, he speaks well, talking a bit of smack and all this stuff. But if you actually strip all of that away and listen to what he's saying, it's just a few little worrying signs that I would just be keeping an eye on, not just in this fight, but in future ones for Yair Rodriguez. And that's our main event. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I heard that interview, and actually John Morgan had a great interview with Yair Rodriguez on the Roadshow last week, which was quite telling in terms of where his mindset in. Let's talk about BJ Penn. Simon, 7 years since his last win in the octagon, and that was against Matt Hughes at UFC 123. Then he fought John Fitch to a draw at UFC 127, and then started his current losing streak. He lost to Nick Diaz at UFC 137. Actually, a fight I was actually at in Las Vegas. Going back to October 2011. That was quite some time away. Then he lost to Rory McDonald, again by decision, at a Fox card in December of 2012. Then he lost to Frankie Edgar, which eventually became his retirement fight at the time, back in July of 2014. And now he's going to fight Yair Rodriguez. I think when he was making a comeback and they had pitched Dennis Seaver, I was on board for that. I thought, right, okay, this is if BJ Penn is serious about making a comeback, this is the best way of building him up in terms of some really good matchmaking. And obviously now we're stuck with Yair Rodriguez, and I think it's going to be a very bad night for BJ Penn. I think it's going to be a loss first and foremost, but I think Yair Rodriguez is going to put him away early. I think he's going to really put it on BJ Penn. He's got a bit of a change of attitude, a change of personality, and I think I don't know. I just feel like there's a little bit more. The aggression is just turning it up a little bit. It's going from a 7-8 to maybe to a 10 or 11 or a 12, and I think he's going to use this opportunity to make to rubber stamp his position in the UFC. I mean, I think for him, he shouldn't even be fighting somebody like BJ Penn. It's great in terms of getting exposure. He's a marquee name and all that good stuff. But I think just from his own personal standards, he should be fighting somebody ranked in the top 10. I think it's going to be a really bad night for BJ Penn, Simon. I don't think he's going to win wherever the fight goes. I think Yair Rodriguez is going to be much more faster, technical, and powerful. He's going to tower over Penn. And I say that with a little bit of hope for BJ Penn in a way, because I saw the Countdown show yesterday, actually, and he's just got this ridiculous knack for just getting you a little bit excited. There's the motivated BJ Penn, and I'm saying that whilst producing air quotes with my fingers right now. The motivated BJ Penn, that motivation might be at 20, 25, 30% looking at the Countdown show, but he's still saying all the right things to get you to that little bit excited to tune in for his fight. So he's always been a fantastic salesman. He knows how to get himself over with the fans. I will be tuning in on Sunday night. I'm going to try and get a nap in if I can, because who wants to stay up till 4, 5, 6 in the morning on a Sunday night? Jesus Christ. But looking at that particular fight, this has got Yair Rodriguez, or how I've kind of termed the phase, Air Force One will land in Phoenix, and I think Air Force One will land all over BJ Penn and demolish him. That's my prediction for the fight.
If I need to do a pick for MMA Junkie this week, and I'm going to go, I think I'm going to go with Yair Rodriguez. I think that's the common sense pick. But I do think that I do think that this is a closer fight than people are giving it credit for. I really do. The big question here is, what shape is BJ Penn going to arrive in? If BJ Penn arrives in shape, Yair Rodriguez has got a fight on his hands. You take a look. Yes, BJ hasn't. BJ's last 3 fights all ended in defeat. But who are they again? He looked terrible against Frankie Edgar. Let's make no bones about this. Frankie Edgar lit him up like a Christmas tree for almost 3 full rounds, eventually stopping him. But that was his first ever fight at featherweight, so we have to factor that in a little bit. And we've seen many fighters who've had a tough weight cut and go out there and not perform on their first go round at a lower weight class. So there's that. You look at, he fought Rory MacDonald, who is one of the best 170-pound fighters in the world, and Rory MacDonald couldn't finish him. It went to a decision. He fought Nick Diaz, one of the best 170-pound fighters in the world, and it was a fight of the night, and Nick Diaz couldn't finish him. Now, the passage of time has gone along since that Diaz fight. That was back in 2011. So it really is a case of how good is BJ Penn going to look. I don't know if they're doing open workouts in Phoenix. If they are, that's going to make for fascinating watching, just to see how he looks. I want to see how he looks at the early weigh-ins. I want to see how he looks on the scale, because he's an elite level fighter. Now, the game may have evolved past him, much like the game has evolved past Ronda Rousey, and we saw that in stark fashion at UFC 207 just a week or so ago. But if Yair Rodriguez goes in there slightly undercooked, slightly overconfident, and BJ goes in there fired up, in shape, BJ Penn could potentially upset the apple cart here. As I say, the common sense pick is Yair Rodriguez, and if he fights to his potential and he does the business, he should do a job on him. But all I'm saying is, devil's advocate and all the rest of it, BJ, I think you still got to respect BJ Penn. You can't not respect a guy who's been in there with the who's who of the sport and has won 2 world championships. If he comes back in shape, and you can bet Jason Perillo will have him in some sort of shape, then I think we could have a fight on our hands. I really do.
I hope we do. I'm just not as optimistic as you are, my friend.
I'm a born optimist.
Well, to be honest with you, so am I. It doesn't take much to make me turn into a pessimist, but I guess I'm more of a realist here, because given the facts and the evidence presented before me, Your Honour, as we head into this return of the prodigy BJ Penn at 38 years of age. God bless him. Well, that's the main event for this weekend's card, and we're not going to start going down the entire fight card because I guess the show's kind of dragging on a little bit. But we are going to finish the show, Simon, with a couple of questions. And once again, really appreciate you guys getting proactive and starting to tweet us actually during the week, which is great because it means I can start to compile the questions for this segment of the show throughout the week. The first one comes from Will Martin. He says, #UFC London is fast approaching. If you could pick the main event, which fight would you make? Over to you, Simon.
Oh, blimey. I hadn't seen these questions. If I could make a fight... Blimey. Main event fight? Okay. If we're to think that Michael Bisping isn't going to fight in London because he's a world champion and he's going to be on pay-per-view points these days, then what we need is a good fight. We need a good fight. We need a fight between two people who perhaps don't get on that well, so make it a bit more sellable. You want to fight between two names who people are going to know, and I would go for a heavyweight fight. I would go, whether this would be a main or a co-main, I think it would just be a good fight. Ben Rothwell and Travis Brown. I like the look of that. I think they match up well. I think Ben Rothwell has been chirping at Travis Brown on social media recently. I think that would be a good fight. The British and Irish fans love Big Ben Rothwell as well. I think that would be a decent fight. Maybe a main event fight, maybe a co-main event fight, I don't know. But there is one fight I do want on that card. I want Brad Pickett versus Neil Seery on that card, please. That's I don't care whatever else is happening anywhere else. I know Neil Seery is supposed to be fighting McCall again. I want Brad Pickett and Neil Seery in London. Have one more, Mr. Seery. Get in there with Brad again, and let's bring the curtain down on both of your careers in London. I think that would be a very poetic way to go out. But yeah,
that's a good shout. Now go on.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, yeah, that's. I don't know whether you do Rothwell versus Brown as a main. I think you could do if you stack the main card enough. But yeah, I think that's one I wouldn't mind seeing. Just straight off the top of my head, because I haven't seen these questions, so I like to go in completely blind with the questions. So, but yeah, Pickett versus Seery, I want to see that irrespective.
Well, for the main event, I think if obviously we can't get Bisping because he's a champion and obviously he'll be doing pay-per-view duties stateside, I think what you could do is you could have two top middleweight contenders that are perhaps vying for Bisping's championship or perhaps have some history with Bisping, because then what you could potentially do is you could still have Bisping fly over and help out with some of the fight week promotion, weighing in and adding some commentary and bits and pieces. So I suppose the guise of Michael Bisping, the Count, if you will, is still lurking over the arena and over the proceedings. So I'd like to perhaps see a Luke Rockhold and or a Chris Weidman, depending who's the healthier and the fitter out of the two for that particular date in March, take on Gegard Mousasi. I think that will perhaps set up a nice title contender down the road. Jacare Souza now has his hands full. He's been booked in a fight. So for me, I would like to see Weidman Rockhold take on Gegard Mousasi, not in a 2-1 handicap match, but one of the two at least. So that'll be my pick. Whether we get it will be interesting, especially because with London, they've really made a lot of strides and effort with not just the UK cards, but the London cards specifically. Last year, having Bisping and Anderson Silva was just absolutely top draw stuff in terms of selling it out, setting a new attendance and gate record for the UFC at the O2 Arena. So they're going to have to put in some hard work to come up with a really, really sellable main event with some marquee fighters. And you know what? I think we might just be days away from finding out what that main event might be. So who knows? Maybe on next week's show, or maybe at least in the next couple of weeks, we'll be dissecting and deciding and mulling over what we think over the UFC London main event. So I've got a question come in from Stephen Murray, and he says, what card and fight are you looking forward to most this year so far? So Simon, over to you for that one.
We haven't got many books, have we, at this point? This is the thing. If you look at, seriously, you take a look at the event. We've got a lot of names on the docket, as they like to say in America. We've got some events lined up. There aren't that. Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson leaps out at me at this point. They only made the fight yesterday, and we were both there to watch that first fight. Amazing performance from Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who looked dead in the water against Tyron Woodley and somehow came back. He got pretty much knocked out, and Woodley committed a crucial error in that fight. Rather than going for the TKO finish, he then looked to lock up a guillotine choke, and Thompson showed incredible resilience to not only survive the choke, but also recompose himself and regain his senses, and then come back and win the final round in order to take it to the scorecards. And it was obviously eventually, after a bit of confusion, it was ruled a draw. I know Woodley's been talking about fighting pretty much everybody under the sun in the last few weeks. He'd shaken hands on a fight with Michael Bisping. He calling out GSP, Nick Diaz. I think he might even have asked for Nate Diaz at one point. Conor McGregor was sort of floated. There's all these potential fights for him. The fight that needed to happen. Damian Maia is the most deserving next guy in line, but this needs to be resolved. I know there are some people out there who say he's had his shot and he didn't win. Wonderboy had his shot and he didn't win. I think when it gets to a world title fight, I think you need a definitive result either way. You can't walk away from a draw. This is why I love Glory Kickboxing. If you get a draw, they give you another round and decide who wins. I'd love to see that in World Championship fights in the UFC. That would, if I could make a rule change, that would be one of them. It would be if the scorecards are even at the end of a world title fight, we go for one more round. Sudden victory. Let's do it. I think that would have been perfect in that particular fight at UFC 205. We're going to get rounds 6, 7, maybe 8, maybe 9. It's going to be a fantastic matchup again. Thompson thinks he can tweak his game to win. Woodley certainly thinks he can win that fight. That's the one that stands out to me. So that's UFC 209, March the 4th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. That card is beginning to take shape. We've got a few decent fights being announced for that. Overeem versus Hunt, I believe, has been signed for that one as well. Britain's Mark Godbeer has got Todd Duffy on that card. Mirsad Bektik taking on Darren Elkins. But yeah, Woodley versus Thompson is my pick, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of the event, 209 is the only one that is head and shoulders above anything else that the UFC has currently got on the schedule over the next couple of months. In terms of the fight I'm looking forward to now, technically, it's not official in terms of the UFC haven't announced it, but I have got a feeling that this time next week, Simon, you and me may be talking about the saga finally coming to an end, an about agreement being signed, and the UFC making it all official. Even though it's technically not there just yet, I am going to say that Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov are going to get it on for an interim lightweight championship at 209. Looking at their social media, they've both pretty much announced that they've signed and they've done all of the bits and pieces, and they're kind of in the training camp now. So I guess the UFC are probably just holding on to that bit of news so they can drop it in some big PR press release, or perhaps even drop it in during the broadcast from this Sunday's Phoenix Fight Night card. When you've got guys who have been on such amazing win streaks, I think it's 8-0 versus an undefeated Nurmagomedov, but I think his win streaks up there as well. 24. But specifically in the UFC, I think he's got about 8 between 8 and 10 fights in the UFC now. Tony Ferguson coming through the Ultimate Fighter system. Like many other fighters have come through that tough show to go on to become champions and to go on to become massive stars in the UFC. This is it's a fighter's fight. It's a hardcore fan community's fight. We've been following their careers for so long, and it looks like and it appears things are finally coming to a head. So for me, Tony Ferguson, Khabib Nurmagomedov, unofficially official, but that is going to be my fight to look forward to most in Q1 of this year. And to wrap things up, one final question, and it's again coming in from Stephen Murray. Do you think the new judges' scoring criteria will lead to more or less controversial decisions? It does make it interesting, in my opinion. So, for those of you who don't know, we are in a new era now. I won't bore you with all the details, but there is a new judging criteria that will hopefully, with some of the new language implemented, allow there to be more 10-8 rounds in MMA. Now, will it lead and cause more confusion? I'm not sure. Maybe, perhaps, but I think we might just get the same amount of controversial decisions as we've ever had. I don't think it doesn't matter what kind of scoring criteria you implement. You could just put the judging criteria and the scoring on its head and give it 100 points or 50 points. So I think when it comes to human error, that's always at play. How you watch, and I think me and Simon, we've spoken about this before. When we sat at press row, we're getting one view, whereas when we're watching it on TV, we're getting the best view. There could be action on the ground on the opposite end of the octagon, and because of where we might be sitting, that might skew some of what we're able to see. Especially when it comes to some of the grappling on the ground and some of the jiu-jitsu that takes place there, where we can't really see all the action. Now, we might need to tilt our heads up at the screen, up just to kind of make sure we're trying to follow up with all of the action there. But I don't think we'll see any more. I just think I always think when human error is involved, there will always be controversial decisions, and actually, that's part of what makes sport so interesting and so controversial at times and so headline grabbing. But what do you think, Si, with this new judging criteria? Do you think we'll start to get more? That's the question. More controversial decisions, or will it just stay the same?
I think we'll get more. Okay. Because the big issue here isn't the changes to the criteria. The issue is the 10-point must system, because it's kind of been forced to fit the sport. It was invented for boxing. Boxing is contested over shorter rounds and more of them. So what it does is it gives you a granular way of scoring a fight. So, if it's a 10-round fight or an 8-round fight, then you've got a sample of scores that tell the story of the fight. In mixed martial arts, you have longer rounds but less of them, and therefore the scoring opportunity, if you like, in terms of how the amount of time is. I'm explaining this terribly badly. A 25-minute boxing match will have more scoring applied to it than a 25-minute mixed martial arts bout, because there are more breaks in the fight, and it's scored at a more regular interval or more frequent intervals than it is in mixed martial arts, and that is the problem. Not the fact that we've only got 3 rounds. It's the fact that the 10-point must system is being applied that way. So there are only 3 possible ways, or there's only 3 opportunities for a judge to assess what's going on. At the end of round 1, at the end of round 2, at the end of round 3. And what that means is there's only 3 decisions for the judge to make. And you've got to tell the story of 15 minutes of action using 3 sets of numbers. And because of that, you could have a 10-8 round in the middle, but if you start off with a 10-8 round, you've pretty much won the fight unless you completely blow it. So, you're in great position, and this is why point deductions are such a controversial topic as well. Because if someone has a point deduction, it can completely kill a fight, because a fight can be going one way. It can be a competitive fight, but one guy clearly winning, and then you could have a point taken for something innocuous, and then all of a sudden you've got this issue where you could have a draw or he's lost a split decision. And that for me is the issue. So if you're in a position where more 10-8 rounds are going to be awarded, I think it skews it even more. And all it will do is highlight the imperfect nature of the 10-point must system in mixed martial arts. I think over the longer fights, I think it should help. Over the 5-round fight, perhaps it should, it might help a bit more. But in the 3-round fights, and that's obviously the bulk of the fights that we get, I think it could cause more issues than it solves. But I understand why they're doing it, because they want people to, try and win fights by stoppage. They don't want people looking to sort of eke out decisions. So I understand why they've tweaked the rules that way. But yeah, I think, and also you've got the application of the scoring as well. The judges are going to have to relearn how to score fights, and they're going to have to apply it. They're so used to applying the scoring criteria that they've been using, and we've been getting controversial decisions. So it'd be interesting. I'm going to have a chat with Ben Cartledge, who's one of the best judges from this side of the pond. He does UFC events, he does Cage Warriors events, Bama events. Events all around the world. He's an excellent judge. I'll have to bend his ear the next time I'm at an event just to see how he's finding it, because it's going to be an interesting change for the judges themselves. They're going to have to effectively, they're basically learning the criteria from scratch again. So it's going to be interesting, and I'm sure we're going to get some weird looking scorecards, as we do anyway.
Well, time will certainly tell. But that wraps it up, Simon. That's all the questions, and that is the end of the show for this week.
Episode number 22, done and dusted, second show of the new year. Thank you, as always, for listening in. Hope you enjoyed the show. You can follow us on Twitter at the Brit Pack MMA. You can follow Mr. Chamatkar Sandhu at Sandhu MMA, and you can follow yours truly at Simon Head. You can subscribe on iTunes. You can subscribe on Stitcher. You can subscribe on Acast, and you can get us on SoundCloud as well. We will also be available on YouTube. It might take us a little bit longer to get the show up on YouTube, but we will have the show up on YouTube as soon as we can. That is all we have time for on episode number 22. Thanks again for at least tuning in. This isn't a radio station, is it? Thank you for listening to the podcast. Enjoy the fights on Sunday night. Set the alarm nice and early. If I were you, get sleep first and just plough through the rest of the day. That seems like the best way to do it. Sleep during the early evening, miss match of the day. Wake up, watch the fights, and then try and survive through work on Monday morning. Best of luck with that, and we'll speak to you next week.